Good evening, everyone, in the room and on the Zoom. There will be one moment. Welcome to this meeting of the Executive of the 1st of November 2022. My name is Councillor Paul Follows, and I'm the leader of the Council and Chairman of the Executive. Louise, could I have apologies for absence, please?
Thank you, Chairman. I've received apologies from Councillors Mirrlees and MacLeod.
Thank you very much. I believe we've got apologies from Councillor Palmer also. Item 2 minutes of the meeting on the 4th of October, published on the website. Can I have members confirm their content to sign us off?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 3, declarations of interest. Anyone? Any received beforehand, Louise? Any from the floor? No? Okay. Item 4, questions from the public. Just before we go into questions from the public, when we get to leader and portfolio holders updates, predominantly going to be focusing on the BIFA item. That will come following these questions from members of the public. There are a number of people on Zoom and additional people in the room specifically to hear that item. So it is right at the top of the agenda. I'll move now to item 4, questions from members of the public. The first question is from Mr. Richard Benson. I believe Councillor Merriweather is going to read that out.
Yes, of course. So the question from Mr. Benson is, during the webinar, Councillor Merriweather made the following points. At 9 minutes 33 seconds, quote, "The amount it costs to heat this building is astronomical," close quotes. And secondly, at 40 minutes and 34 seconds, quotes, "And with our energy bills, ... we're looking at hundreds of thousands of pounds, ... 200,000 to 300,000 pounds a year just to try and heat the building," close quotes. Continuing the question, the cost of gas to heat the Barry's office accommodation in 2021 was £23,733, and in 21-22 was £33,438. The year on year, I think it's supposed to read increase, was £9,705 or 41%. The cost of gas for the first quarter, 22-23, was £10,871, which when annualized would give a cost of £43,484, and the source is the payments to suppliers over £500. That's our database. If the Q1 22-23 cost of £10,871 was annualized and then doubled, it would still only amount to £87,000. And the questions, A, do the executive agree that my figures are correct? B, do the executive agree that the claim, quote, the cost of £200,000 to £300,000 just to try and heat the building, close quote, is not correct? And C, what is the executive committee's revised estimate for the cost of heating the Barry's office accommodation for 22-23? That's Mr. Benson's question, and I thank him for it, and happy to respond as follows. So specific just to the cost of gas, those on the payments database for fiscal 2021 and fiscal 21-22 are by definition historic, and as Mr. Benson says, they showed a 41% increase even before the most recent acceleration in inflation. For completeness, I should note that the payments database is not structured on an accruals basis, and one of the 2 bills recorded in the first quarter, fiscal 22-23, actually relates to March, which is in fiscal 21-22. And so the actual cost for the first quarter, again, just for gas, was £10,724.51, which if annualized would equate to £42,898.04. The first quarter is a lower cost quarter in the year, and costs are continuing to increase, but our base case forecast for this year, fiscal 22-23, is actually slightly lower than Mr. Benson's estimate at around £69,000, with full years from fiscal 23-24 running about £75,900 annually just for gas. That's an annual increase of over 300%, or nearly £50,000 over the fiscal 2021 baseline, equivalent to nearly £500,000 over the same 10-year horizon that's used for the maintenance program. But the figures just for gas exclude the direct financial cost of securing, for example, a serviceable boiler itself, and the other direct and indirect costs, financial and environmental, of the status quo, and which include not just building maintenance backlog, but also, just for one other example, our other energy cost, which is electricity too, which includes for other non-gas heating, ventilating, and air conditioning and air cooling systems and appliances. Our baseline electricity cost in fiscal 19-20 was £76,832, which we expect to increase to around £167,000 just for this year, fiscal 22-23, and then to £183,700 for the full years from fiscal 23-24 onwards, an annual increase of over £100,000 or around 240%. Now, while we don't track what proportion of that electric cost is attributable solely to climate control, I would emphasize again that two of the key energy-related points of this project are not just to reduce our energy use, but to secure as much sustainable energy as possible from the retrofit to reduce all electricity costs, regardless of what they're for. For completeness, I need to mention that all of our current financial assumptions are under review as part of our mid-year update to our medium-term financial plan. We're seeing increased upwards costs and supply pressures on our revenue and capital costs, while our powers to take effective short-term countermeasures is frustratingly limited. So we're on our own financially and have to watch every penny, and that means planning well ahead just as much as fighting the most immediate challenges. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that comprehensive answer. Just to be clear, all the answers are published on the Waverley website afterwards, so if anybody wants to reread and check those figures for themselves, they'll have ample opportunity to do so in a few days. The next question is from Kathy Smythe, and I think you'll be reading that one as well, Mark, so I hope you've got a drink with you.
Thank you, Leader. Yes, so Mrs. Smythe's question is, I refer to the project initiation document, brackets corporate and service projects, close brackets, entitled The Berries Project, dated July 2020, which is available online. In the project background section on page 2, it states as follows, quote, in November 2018, Lambert Smith Hampton were commissioned to undertake a strategy and options evaluation of office accommodation for the council, which was funded by a government grant, close quotes. The question continues, please provide more details of this government grant to include, if possible, 1, when was the grant applied for? 2, when was the grant awarded? 3, how much was applied for and how much was awarded? 4, which WBC council department applied for the grant? 5, who within WBC authorized the grant application? Officer and or committee and or councillor's portfolio holder, and when? 6, what was the grant for? 7, what was the nature and purpose of the funding offered by this grant? 8, which government department awarded the grant? And 9, when was the money received and when was it spent? And was all of it used on the Lambert Smith Hampton report, or did it pay for any other items? And if so, what were these? So that's the question, and the response is as follows. The grant was applied for in 2017 and was awarded in December of that same year. £50,000 was applied for and awarded, and it was the council's estate team that applied for the grant, and the decision to proceed with the bid was made by the council's management board and approved by my predecessor, portfolio holder at the time. The grant was for a Waverley-led project to work with the wider public services in the area to utilise public assets in the vicinity of the Berries office building under the One Public Estate programme operated by the Cabinet Office in conjunction with the Local Government Association. The programme encourages councils to look at locally led partnerships of public sector bodies to collaborate around their public service delivery strategies and estate needs. The intention being to utilise and maximise assets by joining together and ultimately releasing sites for regeneration and housing. The nature and purpose of the grant was to cover Lambert Smith Hampton's fees and additional officer time to conduct the feasibility study for the Waverley Borough Council office project. The grant was awarded by the Cabinet Office and the money was received around October 2018. £38,621.50 was used on the Lambert Smith Hampton report, and the balance was applied towards officer time to conduct the feasibility study. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you very much, Councillor Merriweather. And the final question is from Mrs. Anne Gray. As you are present in the room, Mrs. Gray, did you want to read your question? No, which Mark, would you do the honours for question 3 then?
I think I can now. I've had a drink. Yep. So good evening, Mrs. Gray. And your question is as follows. Over 3,000 residents from Godalming, the surrounding villages and further afield have so far signed a petition of objection to the Central Godalming Regeneration Project proposals. The petition, created by the Save Crown Court Action Group, will be presented to Waverley Borough Council in due course. As the formal Waverley consultation ends, would the finance portfolio holder please accept early sight and scale of this petition while the group continues to gather signatures? Would the finance portfolio holder accept that the petition is perfectly legitimate in its position and does not contain incorrect or misleading information? For information purposes, the petition is worded as follows, and I quote, we the undersigned oppose the building of houses on the main Godalming car park at Crown Court and or the construction of a multi-storey car park at Waverley HQ site at the Berries. We call on Waverley Borough Council to 1. Terminate plans to close or partly close Crown Court car park, stop plans to build houses on Crown Court car park, and 3, reject proposals to build a multi-storey car park at the WBC site or at Crown Court. Crown Court car park is Godalming's largest car park, is used by large numbers of residents and visitors, and is often full. It's easy to use and conveniently sited at the heart of the town, close to shops and retail establishments in High Street and Church Street, the parish church, the bandstand, children's play facilities, and Moss Lane School. A multi-storey car park at the WBC site on the edge of the conservation area overlooking the Lammas lands is inappropriate for Godalming and would be much less easy and convenient to use. And that's the end of the question. And my response is as follows. I believe that Mrs. Gray is referring to an unofficial petition being promoted independently of the extensive official engagement on the Godalming project, which I've referred to before, and not least in both the most recent executive on the 4th of October and the full council on the 18th of October. As of now, we've had no formal notice of this petition, and until we do, I can only remark on what Mrs. Gray describes it to be. But what I said on the 18th of October applies equally now, and I very much hope that the Save Crown Court Action Group, as well as Mrs. Gray and everyone else with a constructive contribution to make, will engage with us, and I sincerely and honestly urge them to do so. As to whether I personally accept that the petition is perfectly legitimate in its position and does not contain incorrect or misleading information, you may recall that at Council on the 18th of October, I also expressed concerns over reports from residents who were feeling misled into signing petitions, and in some cases had done so only to regret doing so afterwards. And I quoted one specific example. So in the interests of full transparency, what would be really helpful indeed would be if the Save Crown Court Action Group could also share with us details of any related canvassing activities and material that were used to promote their petition to its signatories, so that it can be more fully understood in that context. But this isn't just a matter just for me personally, and neither do I know if it's this particular petition that's caused the concerns that I've mentioned. So specific only to Mrs. Gray's question though, I am afraid that some of the text does seem to be confused, if not inaccurate. But the test of whether something is misleading actually has a broader scope than that, because something can be misleading, not just by inclusion, but also by omission. And that's a principle that's so generally accepted that in some cases it's even enshrined into law, for example, in consumer protection regulations. So it is that in assessing this petition, we'd be expected to take into account what it doesn't say about the project, which, at least from what Mrs. Gray has put in front of us here, seems to be a great deal indeed. But for now, we very much look forward to receiving this petition along with all and any other constructive engagement feedback, which we've always committed to considering without prejudice, fairly and reasonably. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you very much, Councillor Merriweather, for very comprehensive and clear answers to those questions. Again, these will all be posted on the website within the next few days. So anybody who wants to look at the details of those answers can do so at their leisure. I'm now moving on to item 6, which is Leader and Portfolio Holders updates. This is obviously a slightly tweaked version of this today because we're going to have an update from Councillor Williams and the Executive Head of Service for this particular area, Chris Wheeler, regarding the BIFA strike, the BIFA staff strike. I will at the end ask everybody if there's any further updates that they want to make on their portfolios. But I just want to make sure that we give enough time to this particular section. To the guests that we have in the Zoom and in the room, although it is the usual practice to only take registered speakers at executive, obviously the nature of this briefing is such that I'm using my discretion as chair to waive those rules this evening, and will, within reason, based on the time, take as many questions from other members as they would like to put forward. So I'll open with Councillor Williams, and then we'll bring in Chris. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, I think we have a presentation which will help to, a PowerPoint which will help to shape out the presentation. If you could just move on from the title slide to the overview. I'll just sort of go through the overview and then I'll pass on to Chris Wheeler for some of the details. Essentially, as people will no doubt be aware already, the crew members of Waverley's Waste Fleet, who are members of the GMB union, in common with so many workers up and down the country facing the challenges of the cost of living crisis, have been balloted for strike action in pursuit of their pay claim. The union members have voted for that strike action, and in the manner required by law have notified their employer of the intention to strike, and their employer being BIFA, who are contracted by us for the delivery of waste services. So the strike is scheduled to commence this Thursday and is currently scheduled to last around 3 weeks. But as it makes clear on that slide, under the terms of the vote, it could be longer, it could be shorter, or of course, in the context of ongoing negotiations, it may not happen at all. So what I would want to emphasize at this point is that this is not a dispute involving Waverley Borough Council. Waverley Borough Council is not in dispute. It is merely the local authority that contracts with that contracts its waste services from an entirely separate public company, BIFA, but as the Borough Council with responsibility for waste services, clearly we are in the process of working round the clock currently, and our officers have been working round the clock in order to ensure that any disruption to the services that are provided for residents of Waverley is as minimal as possible, and that we do everything we can to support our residents of Waverley in the face of what is a difficult situation that is not of our making. And I'll now pass over to Chris Wheeler, who's been heading up the response and the dialogue and the negotiations with Biffa.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Can we have the next slide, please? So clearly been working for some time trying to sort of manage the situation. And we've developed some key strategies around that. The first one is clearly we want to minimise the impact of the strike. And we also recognise that we'd like to see a partial service at least, as some people will want to continue working. And what we want to do is maximise the impact of those collections as far as possible. We also want to ensure that if there is a disruption to the service, we recover that service as quickly as possible. So we've been doing quite a lot of planning work around that. The key piece of work we've been doing is around communications, and that's about keeping councillors and the public well informed, and that we're well prepared to ramp up that communication if and when strike action does occur. We've also been working on the contract legal matters to develop an appropriate strategy to engage with Biffa positively. In terms of our priorities for collection, there are some services, some parts of the service that are more vulnerable than others. Clinical waste services, for example, are critically important to very vulnerable people in our community, so they are going to have an absolute priority. Following that, then the core refuse, residual waste and food waste are then really, really important. I think then we look at recycling services where that is dry material, usually not very offensive, and it can actually stay in bins for a little bit longer or in bags. And then garden waste is obviously a non-statutory service and will be sort of like towards the bottom end of the priorities. Clearly, we want to be collecting refuse and food waste before we collect garden waste, if that comes to it. In terms of street cleaning, that's another part of the service that has potential to be affected. And again, we've set a clear priority with our contractor. The first one being that the duty to keep our roads clear and safe is, in terms of litter and detritus, is really important. So that's there first. Then we want to make sure the town centres are looked after, and then the litter bins from there. Next slide, please. So we have taken a great deal of legal advice and acted upon that regarding the contract. We come to the view that termination of the contract is really unrealistic for a number of reasons, but that we want to maintain services and recover those services quickly in the event of action. We are working on a contract variation to reflect that legal advice. In terms of the financials, there's some key principles at play here, and the primary one is that there should be no gain to Biffa from any savings from salaries from striking staff, and there should be no cost to the council. And we're agreeing an open book analysis plus audit as required to ensure that that occurs. Next slide, please. Moving on to communication and operational issues. The communication principles are very clear for us, is that this is industrial relations are a matter for Biffa and the GMB, but our focus, our external focus is really on advice to residents. So we've got lots of frequently asked questions on the website and ways to contact us for residents. All of the council's channels are ready and are already in use. We will, if strike action does go ahead, we will be suspending the misbin collection service so we can maximise the number of collections we can carry out, but we will maintain the customer helpline going forward. In terms of operational issues, the services will change daily as staffing levels are known. So we won't know each day exactly how many staff are going to be out and what services they'll be doing, but we'll be updating our information as soon as we have that information from our contractor and getting that information out to the public as quickly as we can. As I said, the focus will be on residual and food waste collection with other services as available. We are likely to see some longer days for those staff who are willing to work as they look to maximise those collections. So I'd summarise by saying that we're in a very fluid situation. We do have some reasons for optimism. There are ongoing negotiations, and we're hopeful that that will lead to an agreement. And if that happens, then we're business as usual. But we would be wrong to do anything other than plan on the basis of a strike, and that strike could be quite impactful. We are as ready as we can be, but we have to wait and see. If I go to the last slide. So this is, planning to distribute this slide to members. So this will be a useful point where people can check on the frequently asked questions, and also a handy reminder for the environmental services customer service contact number. I shall pass back to the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Steve, for going through that. I imagine there might be a number of questions, and so if there's any hands in the room, Councillor Costa to start with, and Councillor Munro.
Just two quick questions, if I can, please, Chair. The first one, I'd just be interested to know, although this is about Waverley, I'm interested to know how far Biffa have other contracts of this kind that are likely to lead to issues in other parts of the country. I mean, I just think that will impact the profile. We must focus on Waverley, but I think the context is important. So if anyone has any information on that, I'd be grateful to have it. The other question I wanted to ask is about what our priorities are going to be if we only have a partial service. I get road safety. I understand the thing about litter bins, but I'm not quite sure about the thing around town centres. In particular, I'm not sure what it's meant to include. So, for example, if I take my own communities across the Godalming area, well, Godalming High Street, I guess, is going to be regarded as a town centre. But what about Farncombe? There are lots of retail and built up small pockets of areas across our communities, which would seem to me to have the same issues as some of our main town centres. I guess you might also get some kickback from the rural areas if this is seen as any more than a focus on some of those commercial and retail areas, and that in some way those in more urban areas have a priority over those in more rural areas. So some clarification on that I will be grateful for.
So Chris, and just in terms of from my perspective, the priority areas are the areas with the most need and the most volume of actual waste, which is one of the reasons why the town centres are immediately identified. But I completely take your point. When we look at, say, Farncombe, or we look at, say, Milford, for example, where you've clearly got a retail area, have we got any clarity we can give to that, Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think in terms of street cleaning design, we always focus on the level of footfall, because litter comes from people and not elsewhere. So we'd actually look to focus the resources that are available on the areas of high demand. So that would include town centres, it would include shop fronts and the litter bins in and around those areas. So, but it would also be very dependent on who turns up. So there would be a priority order in there, but it would include not just the town centres, but also those shop fronts as well, because they're important. So.
It's probably just worth me saying that almost all of these things are caveated with how many people and which types of staff turn up as to how far we can cover additional priorities. I think, Councillor Costa. Councillor Munro is next, followed by Councillors Reid and then Gale.
Could I have an answer to my first question? Sorry.
My apologies. Sorry, Steve. Councillor Costa's first question. Can you just repeat?
Just interested to know whether Biffa is going to be in dispute with a lot of other councils and things as well, when this is going to have a higher profile than just Waverley.
Yeah, so the GMB has been having a number of disputes around the country, and some have been resolved quite quickly, and some have taken some time. We do know that just within the Surrey context, there was a dispute between Biffa and the GMB in Tandridge, and that was resolved as well in recent months. So there are pressures on people all over the country, and the GMB are acting on behalf of their members to try and improve their terms and conditions, which is understandable in some circumstances.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Did you want to just jump in for a second?
Yeah, it was just very quickly to add to the response to Councillor Costa's question regarding town centre prioritisation, and the focus there is clearly on footfall, but clearly going forward, dependent on how long this particular action lasts, obviously that will be constantly under review, because clearly the priority is to address the greatest need first, and prioritise, where there is detritus, where there are large numbers of people, and that clearly would be the priority. So, taking the specifics of Farncombe, for example, that Councillor Cossa raised. Clearly, Farncombe is a populous area, and it would be an area that we would be looking very closely at in terms of the day-to-day management of the work on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, Steve. Councillor Munro.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Three things. I represent a highly rural area, but I do accept the logic is to concentrate on town centres. I don't dispute that. And thank you for reassurance that we won't be forgotten completely. But there will be hard choices if there's a major strike here. I've just had a look at the website. I think you probably have plans for improving it, but it would be nice to see the strike absolutely on the front page without having to scroll down, and it's slightly out of date, but hopefully that's in hand, because it'll probably get a lot of traffic. And the last question I have, I fear there is a danger of extra fly tipping as residents lose patience. Are we talking to the police, other authorities, bung it on the website to try and dissuade people and wish people luck in dissuading? Those are my three.
Thank you, Councillor Munro. I can take all three of those. We certainly won't forget your ward because it includes Frensham Ponds, so we'd never, ever, ever forget Frensham Ponds under any circumstances, particularly when it comes to litter. So that reassurance certainly given. In terms of comms, we'll update the web page, the main home page, to put a link, as we often do, for incidents and emergencies. And certainly the web page is going to be updated to include the most recent information that we have as and when the strike actually starts, if it starts. And in terms of the last question, which I've managed to forget, fly tipping. I've asked for comms to be put out at various stages during the strike for however long it lasts, to remind people of the offence that fly tipping is, both from a legal perspective and also from a moral one. And also we have been working with the police and other authorities to increase any pressure we can bring to bear on fly tipping, because it's something that annoys a lot of us most of the time without a strike, let alone with. Just to confirm, Chris, as well, Surrey County Council have also offered to increase their opening hours and or staff resources at the major CRCs.
Yep, that's correct. They have offered some assistance if and when needed.
Councillor Reid is next.
Thank you, Leader, and good evening, everyone. Basically, I wanted to say that, and thank you, Chris, for doing your presentation, and for Councillor Williams' explanations. I live in a rural part of Cranley, and we have very small, narrow byways up which, especially at the end of the My Lane, the small trucks come up. And I was just wondering how much priority we would be given in that case. You know, but we are in the whole of Waverley, but especially in Cranley East, not only rural, but we have more elderly people. So I know and I understand that the vulnerable will have priority. So, but could you say something about, you know, the very narrow access areas, please, because we mustn't forget them. Thank you.
After you, Chris, on this one, but I will add something afterwards.
Thank you, Leader. Yes, thank you, Councillor Reid. I think just going back to the presentation, we're very clear that we're going to focus on refuse and food waste across the borough. So, but it is very dependent on staff availability. That those vehicles will be generally managed by crews who are very knowledgeable, who come there very often. If they're on strike, then it will affect the quality of the service, and we'll look to recover that service as quickly as possible. But we're not actually prioritising different levels of refuse and food waste for different areas. We're going to try and get everything we can as quickly as we can, and if we can't, recover it as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Chris. And just to add, one of the things that I'm sure all of us as councillors have noticed in the past is that the crews that are experienced in dealing with a particular area start to know the bits that are narrow and the bits that are difficult and the bits that they actually need to remember. So I think one of the things, just to manage expectations, is that if we have crews that do not know the area as well, or the specific bit they're being asked to do, there is probably a higher possibility of things being missed anyway, just for that regular reason. Okay, I've got Councillor Gale, followed by Councillor Hegan.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just 3 quick questions, please. Food waste is probably going to be one of the most difficult things for people, especially where I am, because of foxes and things like that, if it accumulates. Is there any possibility that Surrey could open up a food waste bin or something at the CRCs? That would actually help. The next question is garden waste. People out here, obviously lots of garden waste, and they're asking, would there be any refunds for non-collection? And the last question is, when the system does come back online, will the BIFA chaps take extra waste away? Can we put it in boxes, bags and things like that to be taken away? Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you, Councillor Gale. Yes, so in terms of food waste, the tips, that's something we can specifically ask Surrey, but at the moment we haven't determined what we need yet, but I'll certainly make sure that that's flagged to Surrey as a question and a possibility. In terms of refunds for garden waste, we don't yet know what the impacts are, so it's impossible to say what response we're going to have yet. I think we have to see what the impacts are and then make a decision as to what's the best way of managing that going forward. So we'll have to wait to see on that one and come back to you. In terms of extra waste, yes, in the event of a strike, we are expecting full recovery. Again, one of the questions earlier was about fly tips. Well, actually, if we're very clear that we will come back and we will clear extra, hopefully that will prevent some of those fly tipping issues as well.
Thank you, Maxine. Councillor Hegan. Councillor Hegan, I think you're next, if you can hear me.
Oh, yes, thank you, Leader. I'm being told my internet connection's unstable, so hopefully you don't lose me. I'm a bit concerned when we talk about the priority on street cleaning being on safety. To me, one of the biggest safety issues at the moment is the amount of leaf debris that is going to be on the roads, and that is going to be more the rural areas, but it will affect pavements and the town centres. I mean, I would like to flag that I would want to hear that that is going to be a priority over and above what I'd call general litter that might not have the same safety connotations. So that's the first point. And the second point is I'd just like a bit more clarification about the contract negotiations that are ongoing, the changes that are hoped for and what they will achieve for us. So those are my 2 questions.
Chris / probably Annie as well, I imagine, on the contract side.
Yeah, in terms of road safety and street cleaning, one of the key things that happens if we don't sort of sweep and manage the roads is that you get a build of leaf fall and silt into areas, and that can lead to flooding. So clearly that's one of the main focuses. But again, it does depend on who's on strike and what's available in terms of skills to actually continue with that work. So, but what we'd want to do is focus on that road safety first, which I think you're right is leaf fall and associated detritus that can lead to further issues is clearly up there in terms of priorities.
Can I just flag on that one before I come to Annie that particularly those of you that are double or triple hatters, that if your parishes are flagging areas that are genuinely a hazard, a risk, that they should try and flag them up to Waverley as soon as possible so that we can understand the areas that are a problem, particularly in the more rural areas where they might otherwise get missed. Annie.
Good evening, everyone. Councillor Hegan, thanks for the question. The contract negotiations are a feature of how we are managing the potential dispute. As Councillor Follows has already said, this is a dispute between the GMB and BIFA rather than Waverley, and our relationship is contractual with BIFA. So in terms of ensuring that the council gets value for money, what we have looked at doing, there are 2 routes to look at the contract, and that is either to start serving, if you like, notices on the contractor saying they failed to deliver the contract and then land up in long-term complex negotiations, or the route that we have chosen is to have an open book policy where we will review with them who came into work, what costs were saved by them, and simply claim that money back or not pay it to them in the first place when it comes to the monthly bill. So the variation is a contractual notice that we serve on them saying we're not actually varying the contract, we are varying how we collect money from them and how we pay them. in relation to the strike. And we think that's a much better, a much shorter way of recovering and providing value for money for the public by having this open book approach. So it's not actually altering the terms of the contract other than the payments and making sure that we don't pay for services that we haven't actually had from them during this dispute. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. So are BIFA happy with that concept? Have they agreed it in principle?
They've agreed it in principle, and the other thing that they asked for, they initially asked for it to be a relief event, which is we've refused and said the only relief is from termination of the contract for failure to deliver it. And there was not a difficult disagreement over it. It was more, they'll give it a try and we're going to say no. So they are relatively happy, and that feels fair, and more, and it also feels like we have a relationship with them to continue delivering the best service possible during a very difficult time for them and for us.
And just for my own information, and probably for others as well, they're what, about 3 years into a 7-year contract? Is that about right?
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. I've next got Councillor Peter Marriott.
Thank you, Leader. I just wonder is it possible to give residents some notification of when their bins might be collected or not? And what would be the principle if it's not collected, let's say in a partial collection, will they be then delayed to the fortnight later before they might be collected again?
To preempt one thing, some of it's going to depend on who shows up for work. But Chris.
Yeah, I'd say that the situation is extremely fluid. You know, it depends on who turns up to work and then how long the strike goes on for. So if it lasts one day and they come to an agreement, then we'll pretty much recover on Saturday. If it lasts for a longer time, then it becomes very difficult to recover, and then you are looking at suspension until the next collection round. So it very much depends on what actually happens through the rest of this week and who turns out on Thursday.
And Peter, we'll be using the website as well as emailing all members as frequently as we can to update them on what advice they can give to residents as to how to manage the way through this. We can only do this when we know what resources we're dealing with when and if it starts. So it's a case of all members keeping an eye out for communications from Chris and Annie over the course of the next couple of weeks. Councillor Seaborn is the last hand I've got up.
Thank you, Leader, and thanks very much for facilitating this really useful session. It's much appreciated. Can I address a question to Chris? Can he comment on the distribution of unionisation amongst the BIFA crews? Is it random, in which case we might possibly expect around 50% of crews to be able to function, or at least 50% of the total operation to function? Or is there any element of systemization where perhaps drivers are more unionized than others, in which case the impact might be significantly greater? Thanks very much.
That one I will have to ask you to do, Chris.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you, Councillor Seaborn. I think union membership is an individual matter for each individual, and they don't have to declare that to their employer. So we don't actually have an exact picture of who is within the union, and equally we're not their employers either, so we wouldn't know that in the first place. We also don't know how that. Of those who have, because GMB have voted to strike, it doesn't mean that all of their members will strike, though obviously there'll be a lot of pressure on that to be a full turnout if they do want to turn out and strike. We also know that elsewhere, when there has been strike action, it has impacted on other members of staff. Sickness has increased, for example, rather than cross a picket line, people have become unwell, for example. How unwell they are, we obviously don't know. I don't want to speculate as to whether we will see a half service or a three-quarter service or a quarter service. I don't want to raise any expectations and then come to you and say, actually, for these reasons, a number of other people didn't turn up. It is, as I said, a very fluid situation. We won't know until Thursday morning, and when we know on Thursday morning, we will be updating all councillors, all residents as quickly as we possibly can through our communication channels.
Thank you, Chris. Steve?
Yes, just just really, I think these have been very, very helpful questions, and particularly, I mean, the last question is one that kind of reflects, I think, a frustration that a lot of us feel, that we actually don't know how this is actually going to impact us in the first instance. And obviously, as I think we've said this evening, as times goes on through this dispute, then clearly issues will emerge, concerns will arise. And so I would just urge, in the event of this dispute continuing, beyond this week and into next week and beyond, that councillors keep us appraised of the issues that are actually affecting your local areas, your local wards, and also that parish and town councils, again, raise any specific concerns that they've got, so that we can potentially nip any problems in the bud and serve the residents as best we possibly can in difficult circumstances.
Thank you very much. I'm not seeing any further hands on the Zoom, but I'll just offer one last opportunity for those in the room or on the Zoom to ask any further questions. Nope, in which case, thank you all for participating and for attending this. Can I also just thank our officers for the amount of work that I know has gone into making sure that we are as prepared as it is possible for us to be on this subject. And at some point, somebody will probably want to have a discussion, I imagine, in this place about keeping services in-house rather than contracting out, but that's probably another subject for another day. At which point I shall move on to item set. Sorry, just before we go to item 7, are there any other portfolio holder updates anybody wishes to make? Councillor Townsend.
Thank you, Leader. I just wanted to give one update, because I will be delivering the biodiversity policy and action plan a bit later. I just wanted to say that I'm delighted to report that we have today received a note from the programme officer for the Inspector of Local Plan Part 2, stating that after carefully considering submitted evidence and the written and oral statements of examination participants, the Inspector is of the view that no further main modifications over and above those already communicated through the hearing sessions are necessary in order to make the plan sound and or legally compliant. So obviously we must await the inspector's final report to understand his full reasoning. However, at this stage, it is encouraging that he considers that only limited main modifications are required. We are therefore cautiously optimistic that we will not be required to consider allocating additional housing sites, and that we will be able to progress Local Plan Part 2 to adoption early in 2023. This will be important in providing up-to-date development management policies and helping to achieve a 5-year housing land supply for the borough. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you. And just on that subject, I won't be as ecstatic as I was earlier when I read that email and had to read it twice to make sure I'd read it correctly. But just want to pass on the thanks to the team in the planning department who've actually made that possible, because that's actually a really significant achievement considering all of the pressures and constraints of the planning system at present.
I will pass them on.
Thank you very much, Councillor Townsend. I think Councillor Merriweather, you had an update as well.
Thank you, Leader. Just to draw members' attention to the agenda for overview and scrutiny resources on Monday next week, which includes the update to the medium-term financial plan for this current year, which I strongly encourage everybody to read. Back in February, we looked at a plan which was forecasting an unresolved budget shortfall increasing to about £884,000 per year by fiscal 25-26, cumulatively nearly £2 million over the MTFP period. We have revised our assumptions on inflation because of the most recent experience. We expect it, like everyone else now, to peak at a much, much higher level than we were looking at back in February, and we expect it to prevail at a high level for much longer until it falls, hopefully back to around about the 2% level in fiscal 25-26. But that change adds £5 million to our annual budget over the MTF period, which is a substantial sum of money. Now, even though we are extremely limited on funding, We are fortunate to, for various reasons, to sit on cash balances, which does mean that the most significant offset, the most significant compensation that we have for this inflation is improved interest income from the cash that we have on deposit. That's the largest single mitigation that we have, but we are looking, as we always do, at other compensating measures that we can take, because at the moment, our unresolved budget shortfall by 25-26 is now almost twice the value that we were looking at just back in February. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. Any other updates from anybody on this particular occasion? No, in which case we'll move then on to item 7, freehold infringement purchase of 1 to 32 Wyatt's Close, Godalming and surrounding land. Councillor Paul Rivers to introduce.
Thank you, Leader. I will endeavour to be as brief as you know I can on this extensive report, excellent report. So, members, this report before us tonight proposes that the executive uses its delegated authority to approve the purchase of the freehold interest in numbers 1 to 32 Wyatt's Close, Godalming, for the total cost of just over 1.2 million to be funded through the housing revenue account. Currently, the council holds these homes on a long leasehold with 33 years unexpired, and the freeholder is National Corp Limited. The market value of the site and homes is of the order of 2 million, identified by an independent market valuer. Details of that is in the report. And I point out the obvious, that there is a good demand for these homes, which are 1-bedroom bungalows in an area with good transport links and local services, which meet our local housing needs. Securing the freehold of this site will consolidate the council's holdings on Wyatt's Close and will provide the social housing with a secure future. So I propose that the executive accepts the recommendations that are set out in paragraph 2 of section 7 of our agenda. And in summary, it's a very good thing. Why wouldn't we? Thank you. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Rivers. I've got one registered speaker, which is Councillor Hegan, if you'd like to ask your questions.
Thank you, Leader, and thank you, portfolio holder. I'm actually familiar with these properties, and I completely agree that the ability to obtain them at below market value is a major positive for the council, and to me, going with the recommendations is a no-brainer. But I have been invited informally as the Vice Chair of the Resources Overview and Scrutiny Committee to look at this proposal in some detail before today's meeting, because various breakdowns in the governance process do mean that this is having to be dealt with outside the normal processes. And that does give me cause for concern, because if the decision was less of a no-brainer, I think we could find ourselves tonight in quite an awkward situation. And I am concerned that at a time of flux in terms of staffing levels, changing responsibilities, I think we are seeing a need for a more robust project monitoring and management system to make sure we avoid this situation on a more marginal decision.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hegan. There's a few elements of this I'll probably raise with you separately, but the executive also raised some concerns regarding the governance of this particular matter. As far as I'm concerned, all the root causes of that particular governance issue have been addressed and dealt with by the Chief Executive and by the Executive Head of Housing. I'll certainly go into more detail, and I'm happy to go into more detail with the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, specifically on the subject. And I agree, if this were a decision that was less of a no-brainer, it is unlikely, or indeed as urgently required in terms of actually actioning the decision, it is unlikely that we proceed in this manner. Is there any other member of the executive wanting to add anything to that or comment more generally? In which case, I'm very, very happy to propose the recommendations as outlined by Councillor Paul Rivers. I am not going to read out the exceptionally lengthy details of those recommendations, but can I have your, do you approve of recommendations 2.1 through 2.4 to action this decision? Can I have all those in favour, please show. Thank you. Item 8, the Biodiversity Policy and Action Plan. I believe Councillor Townsend is introducing this one tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. This administration has demonstrated its firm commitment to the climate crisis with the recent adoption of the Sustainability and Climate Change SPD recently, which is a very positive step forward. And today we're bringing forward our comprehensive biodiversity policy, indicating a further commitment to improve Waverley's natural environment by enriching the borough's biodiversity, increasing habitat connectivity across the landscape, and promoting and encouraging community engagement. This policy is seeking to halt the decline and improve biodiversity on land under our control, and formalises this administration's commitment to begin to achieve this. This is an area we know that is important to our residents and on which they expect the council to lead on. This adds to the suite of environmental policies that this council has already adopted, leading from our carbon neutrality action plan and including the sustainability SPD that I mentioned earlier, our tree and woodland management policy and our pesticides policy. The biodiversity policy has been created after a lot of research and hard work by our professional green spaces officers, who I'd like to thank on behalf of this executive. They have a deep knowledge and commitment to the areas that we own and manage. They have involved other stakeholders, and the policy has been developed under the guidance of the Surrey Wildlife Trust. All of this is outlined within the report. This document has been through the scrutiny process, and additional information has been included in accordance with the committee's recommendations. This policy not only outlines our approach to biodiversity, it also sets out a clear and long-term action plan for the future. There's also a handy summary of the policies that are in the overall policy on pages 69 and 70 of your report that you can have a look at. We are extremely fortunate to live in a borough which has some exceptional areas of landscape with important wildlife and a wide range of habitats, some of which is directly under the stewardship of this council. That includes sites of special scientific interest, local nature reserves, and sites of nature conservation importance. Our aim is to ensure that our open spaces are managed to maximise biodiversity and provide access to diverse open spaces for residents now and in the future. I do hope that the executive will adopt this policy and the action plan this evening, and I'm sure that Councillor Williams will also want to add a few words on this point. Thank you. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you very much, Councillor Townsend. And yes, want to echo that thanks to officers. I'm sure you'll all be very surprised to learn there are no registered speakers on this item, but Councillor Williams.
Yeah, yes, very, very briefly. We are reminded daily of our climate and ecological emergency, and as we're aware, the new Environment Act does require us, from us as a council, biodiversity reports, local nature recovery strategies, and consideration of biodiversity net gain. And it is something that we are passionate about. As Councillor Townsend said, this is part of a suite of policies which we have developed, including trees and woodland policy, pesticides policy, and of course, it relates very directly to our carbon neutrality action plan. It has also actually been on quite a long journey of governance. There have been lots and lots of discussions. There's been a lot of input into this from various councillors, and it's been through the overview and scrutiny process. And I'm convinced that it's as good as it can get. And I know our officers have worked extremely hard in order to ensure that it is as good as it gets, and it actually aligns with our corporate commitment. to biodiversity and to tackling our climate and ecological emergency. I believe it's an excellent policy. It equips us well in terms of going forward to try our best to ensure that Waverley is a borough in which biodiversity flourishes. So I would urge members of the executive to support it.
Thank you, Councillor Williams, and here. I'm very much hoping the government might issue some secondary legislation on the Environment Act to help us actually implement and enforce some of this going forward, but we will live in hope on that front. Any other speakers on this item? No, in which case I'll bring to the recommendation, which is that the Executive Committee adopts the Biodiversity Policy and Action Plan as council policy. Can I have all those in favour, please show? Thank you very much. I have no need to exclude press or public under item 9, and there's no additional items to be considered and exempt. And so at 7 o'clock on the dot, we are done. Thank you all.